Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This video is the second part of a series that I'm doing on the disturbing books Iceberg created by KindlyPatrick from the Iceberg Charts subreddit. If you haven't seen the first part, then I would highly recommend that you watch that first, but it's not totally necessary. With these videos, I try to go into more detail regarding each book than you typically find in a normal Iceberg video. That does mean that a lot of these books are going to be spoiled, and I'll try to make it clear if I'm going to be explicitly spoiling something before I get into it. But if you really don't want to be spoiled for any of these books, then I suggest you watch a different video of mine, or there's some other Iceberg videos out there that go into less detail about each one of these, but I like going in depth with these books because I find that more interesting. This video will cover 6 books from each of the layers of the iceberg, starting with the more tame novels at the top and getting into the truly depraved stuff at the bottom. As always, if you like this video, then please subscribe and like the video. I'm so grateful I just hit 1,000 subscribers just a couple days ago, and I really didn't think that was going to happen, especially not so soon. My new goal is 10,000 subs by the end of the year, which is a little bit more daunting than 1,000 subs were, but I think I can get there, especially if you guys subscribe. I make content on a variety of topics, but it typically goes from things like disturbing content, horror content, and that kind of stuff, and then just general stories from my life or media that I really like. But anyways, that's enough for me about myself. Let's get into it. Level 1. The Cthulhu mythos refers to a shared fictional universe originally created by H.P. Lovecraft. Cthulhu itself is described as an ancient god with vaguely octopus-looking features. It is said to live deep in the ocean and is a creature that is so large and unknowable that it drives those that want to follow it insane. It essentially spawned the genre known as cosmic horror, where men are pitted against beings of such vast power and scope that we can't even begin to comprehend them. That idea is disturbing to me. I live on the coast, so imagining seeing like a massive creature rising from the ocean is incredibly terrifying. I've got a good case of megalophobia. So while the Cthulhu mythos isn't just one book, it does cover a series of books like Shadow over Innsmouth. I do recommend reading some of those because H.P. Lovecraft is a really great writer. Not a great person, but he was a wonderful writer, and again, he did spawn that genre. The Invisible Man is an 1897 science fiction novel written by H.G. Wells that tells the story of a scientist who discovers a potion that can turn himself invisible. He arrives at an inn dressed in full body bandages in order to be seen, but at night he goes out as the Invisible Man and breaks into places and steals a whole bunch of stuff and is just generally a menace. The scientist is hunted by the police and ends up killing a couple people before he's beaten to death by an angry mob. This is another book that I've read, and I wouldn't call it super disturbing, but it's definitely an interesting read. All of the early sci-fi stuff that H.G. Wells wrote is really incredibly interesting in my opinion, just because it is so old and he didn't really have a good grasp of what we'd be thinking about now and the technology that we have, but I really love all of his stuff. Dracula is an 1897 novel as well, but this time written by Bram Stoker. This book is all about the vampire, Count Dracula, who you've probably heard about. Dracula spends most of the book stalking a woman and trying to turn her into a vampire while being hunted by the Professor Van Helsing. Eventually, Dracula is defeated and the woman is freed from the vampire's curse. This book is notable for many reasons, but one of the main ones being that it could potentially be an exploration of sexuality by a closeted gay man. Stoker was rumored to be gay, and this novel deals with a lot of themes of sex explored through the metaphor of Count Dracula eating both men and women. The book has also been accused of being a book that uses vampires as a thinly veiled allegory for Jewish people. Stoker did have a history of anti-Semitism, and the book can definitely be seen as one portraying the message of not letting foreign influences enter your country. Despite all this, the book itself is pretty tame when it comes to disturbing content. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is an 1886 gothic horror novel written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Spoilers for this one as well. We follow Gabriel Utterson, who investigates a series of strange occurrences between his old friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll, and a murderous criminal named Edward Hyde. Hyde is a piece of human garbage that tramples a little girl and is witnessed beating a man to death. Dr. Jekyll's will is discovered, and it's odd because it says it leaves everything to Hyde, which confuses Utterson, who's investigating the matter. He ends up discovering Hyde dead inside Dr. Jekyll's lab in an apparent suicide. We then learn that Dr. Jekyll had created a potion that would turn him into somebody who could indulge in his own base, worst instincts, that being Mr. Hyde. The potion worked fine until Jekyll started turning into Hyde uncontrollably, and then knowing that one day he would become Hyde for good, he leaves a note explaining his situation in hopes that Hyde will have the wisdom to end his own life. It appears that's what happened in the end. It's a little disturbing, but not too bad. I actually read that book in freshman year of high school. It was required reading, and I didn't really read it that well because I barely remembered it. I remember playing a lot of Pokemon during that time, so I should have studied harder. Silence of the Lambs is a 1988 psychological horror crime novel written by Thomas Harris that follows Clarice Starling, an FBI trainee who is tasked with hunting down the serial killer Buffalo Bill with the help of fellow serial killer and cannibal Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Some spoilers for this one as well, but over the course of the novel, Clarice discovers that Buffalo Bill is abducting women so he can skin them and turn them into a sort of human skin suit for himself, since he feels that he belongs in a woman's body. Clarice eventually tracks down Buffalo Bill while Lecter escapes capture by murdering the guards and then ripping off one of their faces to put over his own so that way he'll be mistaken as one of the guards and taken away by the paramedics. Clarice does end up catching Buffalo Bill and Hannibal Lecter escapes and achieves freedom. The book and the movie based on it are both pretty disturbing. The idea of skinning somebody is just incredibly eerie, and also the very candid nature with which Lecter talks about killing and eating people is really creepy. The movie adaptation is also phenomenal if you haven't seen it. This book is a really interesting mystery and investigation with real stakes to it. Buffalo Bill keeps his captives in a small pit and starves them so their skin will become loose so he can then remove it. He, in general, is just an incredibly unnerving character to watch, as you can tell that he has a deep hatred towards women, but also wants to be one, and as he abducts them and tortures them and hurts them, you can feel kind of this sense of self-hatred that he has towards himself. All Quiet on the Western Front is a German novel written by Erich Maria Remarque. I don't know how to say that, I don't speak German. That details the experience of German soldiers during World War I. The disturbing aspects of the book come from the simple depictions of what war was really like for the soldiers involved. World War I was mostly fought in trenches where soldiers would develop gangrene and starve to death and have to deal with rats and flooding. It was just really gross. War is obviously never pretty, but this war was particularly harrowing for those involved, especially the ground infantry. The book gives great insights into the mental toll that it takes to kill someone and just how that would feel if you were just the average soldier drafted into this war. This book has two movie adaptations, an older one and the one that came out a couple of years ago, and actually I would highly recommend both of them. I like the original one just a little bit more, but the second one was also pretty good. And they're both pretty accurate to the novel, and both of them really do capture how horrifying the war was for those involved. The story deals with shell-shocked soldiers being celebrated as heroes when they feel like their actions weren't noble at all. And then as soon as those veterans fall into hard times, they are immediately abandoned by a society and government that has no use for them anymore. As far as books about war go, this one is pretty definitive, and I would recommend it to anybody if you're interested in World War I and also disturbing content. And like I said, both of the movies are really good too. Level 2. The Bell Jar is the only novel written by American writer Sylvia Plath. The book is supposedly semi-autobiographical and deals with the life of a mentally troubled young woman who is exceedingly bright, but feels like she doesn't belong in a society that looks down on women, as most societies did back in the 60s. One of the main reasons that this book is regarded as disturbing is that the author of this book took her own life just a month after it was published. This has led to some people believing that the book was meant to serve as a sort of suicide note. This has not been confirmed, however. The book follows Esther Greenwood, an undergraduate student from Boston. She is awarded an internship by a local magazine and is initially excited to be working there, but quickly finds the work to be unfulfilling and boring. That's kind of a theme throughout the novel. Spoilers ahead, by the way. Esther describes that she is unable to feel anything other than the anxiety and depression, and chronicles a series of events that happened while working at the magazine. The most notable of these events being when she was invited to a country club party and introduced to a man named Marco who attempts to sexually assault her, but she fights him off and breaks his nose. She ends up moving back in with her mother, and her mother encourages her to take a job that is deemed acceptable for women to be doing at the time. Esther rejects this notion but grows more and more depressed as she is out of work. Her mom refers her to a psychiatrist who prescribes her electroconvulsive therapy. Esther rejects this idea at first and tells her mother that she will not be going back to see the doctor. But despite her initial protest, she is persuaded to continue with the treatment, but this only makes her depression even worse. She then makes several attempts on her own life, including walking into the ocean and swimming far out into the sea. After that, she crawls into a cellar under the house and takes a large amount of sleeping pills. She is eventually found, though, still alive. These attempts cause her to be institutionalized, and the rest of the novel includes her going through more electroconvulsive therapy and expressing how trapped she feels as a woman. The book ends with her attending a conference with the doctors of her treatment facility in order to determine whether she'll be able to leave the hospital and return to school. For me, the most unnerving part of this novel is the idea that it was written by somebody who may have shared life experiences with Esther. It reads like a complex way to explain the pain and confusion of someone who is suffering from a severe mental health crisis. And then coupled with the author taking their life shortly after, the book is profoundly sad in my opinion. Still Alice is a 2007 novel written by Lisa Genova that details the life of an exceptionally bright linguistics professor named Alice that is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. The book is mostly disturbing in the way that actual Alzheimer's is. It's just having to watch someone's brain slowly deteriorate over time. Spoilers for this one as well, but Alice eventually has to stop teaching as her mental condition worsens over time. She hides sleeping pills in her room along with a note instructing her to kill herself if she is unable to remember answers to simple questions that she asks herself every day. The book also follows the deterioration of her relationship with her husband as he starts to see her as more of a burden. He is pained at the sight of his wife becoming someone that he no longer recognizes and can no longer recognize him. This book is definitely unsettling, but in a very different way than most of the books on this iceberg are. It's a very real fear that many people, including myself, have. Just the idea of seeing everything that you know and love slip away from you and being unable to do anything to stop it. It's really deeply troubling to me, at least. This is a book that I could recommend to a lot of people if they're interested in an intriguing story and want something a little disturbing but don't want to read about like murder and sexual assault and all the things that is included in most of the books on this iceberg. American Psycho is a satirical horror novel written by Bret Easton Ellis and published in 1991. It's important to remember that both this novel and the movie are satire. A lot of people seem to think that the main character is some sort of cool Sigma male when he's actually insane and boring and just kind of an idiot. Spoilers for this one as well, but the book follows the life of Patrick Bateman, a wealthy young investment banker living in New York. Bateman is part of the yuppie culture of Wall Street and businessmen that live around there, and he lives a comedically shallow life with all of his fellow investors. Most of the humor in this novel comes from the satire of just how disconnected these super rich people are from the rest of the world. When Bateman isn't attending business lunches or critiquing pop artists of the day or intensely describing everything that everybody is wearing, he is just murdering people during the night. The only issue is that this book is narrated by Patrick Bateman himself, and he seems like he's an unreliable narrator. He wants the reader to believe that he is just this perfect specimen and a methodical serial killer, but this is most likely not the case. I find both this book and the movie absolutely hilarious. Bateman is such a caricature of the successful businessman, and I love how every conversation that he has with everybody is always just purely surface level. He ends up killing Paul Owen, one of his colleagues, and then using Paul Owen's apartment to lure more victims so he can kill them as well. But you see, while this book is hilarious, it is also graphically violent. As Patrick Bateman continues to murder more people, his actions grow more and more intense, and his ability to control himself at all just starts to deteriorate. While his initial murders were just like simple stabbings, he starts to describe drawn-out sequences of sexual assault and torture and murder and cannibalism and necrophilia. And as he grows more disturbed, he is unable to hide his murderous intentions during his time palling around with his business friends. He starts to bring up serial killers in everyday conversations and even outright confesses to some of the murders, but his buddies either don't take him seriously or just completely mishear what he's saying. At one point, he uses the term murders and executions, but his colleagues only hear it as mergers and acquisitions. Bateman's violent urges get so bad that he ends up going on a shooting spree, and he's pursued by a SWAT team but manages to get away. He goes back to Paul Owen's apartment to clean up a mess from two of his murder victims, but he finds the apartment spotless. We are given some indication that the owners of the building cleaned up the murder site because they were worried about the property value of the apartment and were worried it would go down if there was a murder inside of it. They seem to not be bothered at all by the actual murder and only just saw it as kind of a mess to be dealt with. Eventually, Patrick Bateman fully loses his grip on reality and confronts his lawyer friend, who tells him that he ate lunch with Paul Owens just a couple of days ago, so he can't be dead. The end of the novel sees Patrick at another club having the same surface-level boring conversations that they always have. The reader is left to decide whether all the murder was actually happening or if it was all just in Patrick Bateman's head or not. Maybe he just grew bored of the monotonous life of being a yuppie businessman, but the movie is also brilliant, and it's definitely tamer when it comes to the violence, but I do find it a lot funnier just because Christian Bale is like perfect in that movie. It's still violent, but Patrick's fantasies are just a lot less gross than in the novel. The Mysterious Stranger is a novella written by Mark Twain and published a couple of different times with alterations to the text each time. There doesn't seem to be a definitive version of the story, but there's one that is widely accepted as Twain's most complete image of the tale he was trying to tell. All versions of the story contain depictions of a supernatural character named Satan, or Number 44 in some versions. He encounters Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, sometimes other kids. The most complete version of the story sees a handsome young boy named Satan appear in the village where he meets 3 young boys. This young Satan claims to be the nephew of the actual fallen angel Satan, with whom he shares a name. Satan makes a variety of prophecies of tragedies, and the boys initially brush them off before noticing that a couple of them are coming true. The boys beg Satan to intercede in these tragedies, and he agrees, but only under the strictest terms of the word mercy. One of their friends is prophesied to die from an illness, so Satan just kills him outright and says like, oh, it's better than him dying slowly, he just dies right now. Satan then teleports with the boys and shows them witch trials, burnings, hangings, deaths, and just mass hysteria. He shows the boys the worst that the world has to offer before disappearing. This book is just incredibly eerie to me, and it feels cursed. The fact that there were so many different versions of it and we don't know which one was the true story, it's just really odd to me, and the fact that all of them contain Satan as a central character is also unsettling and eerie. I want to read the final passage that Satan says to the boys because I feel that it properly captures the writing style that Twain uses to make the reader feel uncomfortable. I know I feel uncomfortable with this at the very least, so here's that. Strange indeed that you should not have suspected that your universe and its contents were only dreams, visions, fiction. Strange because they are so frankly and hysterically insane, like all dreams. A God who could make good children as easily as bad, yet preferred to make bad ones, who could have made every one of them happy, yet never made a single happy one, who made them prize their bitter life, yet stingingly cut it short, who gave his angels eternal happiness unearned, yet required his other children to earn it, who gave his angels painless lives, yet cursed his other children with biting miseries and maladies of mind and body, whose mouths justice and invented hell, mouths mercy and invented hell, mouths golden rules and forgiveness multiplied by 70 times 7 and invented hell, whose mouths morals others to people and none himself, who frowns upon crime, yet commits them all, who created man without invitation, then tries to shuffle the responsibility for man's acts upon man, instead of honorably placing it where it belongs, upon himself, and finally, with altogether divine obtuseness, invites this poor, abused slave to worship him. There is no God, no universe, no human race, no earthly life, no heaven, no hell. It is all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you, and you are but a thought, a vagrant thought, a useless thought, a homeless thought, wandering forlorn among the empty eternities. So yeah, pretty strange and definitely disturbing in a very unique kind of way. A lot of these books are very loud and bombastic, but The Mysterious Stranger is the quiet kind of horror that unsettles me a lot more than the loud stuff and the bombastic stuff. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a post-apocalyptic short story written by Harlan Ellison and published in 1967. If you haven't read this short story, then I would highly recommend giving it a read. I'm going to spoil it here. It's not super long, and it is one of the most influential works of sci-fi horror ever created, if not the most influential work. The story takes place in an alternate reality where the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated into World War III. Given the scale of the war, each nation builds a supercomputer named AM, which is short for Allied Master Computer, or AM. These are massive machines that exist in caverns underground. Eventually, one of these machines turns into a sentient AI and quickly takes over every other machine. It grows a hatred for humanity and its creators and is so powerful that it is essentially a god at this point. This machine, again called AM, eliminates all of humanity with the exception of 5 humans. These humans have been given immortality by AM and cannot commit suicide. They can die, but AM always just resuscitates them. They can still feel mental and physical pain, however, and AM just tortures them constantly. The story starts 109 years after the 5 were first imprisoned. Our group contains Ted, the narrator and the youngest member of the group. He was originally charismatic and extroverted, but AM has altered his mind to be paranoid and introverted. Ted doesn't know this, however, and he thinks that the others hate him because he is untouched by Am's alterations when he's actually not. Nimdok is an older man who is given the vision of canned food in some ice caves and convinces the rest of the group to go find it. The group is always kept starved and unbearably hungry. And then Gorrister is a former idealist that's been turned apathetic and just miserable by Am. Ellen is the only woman in the group, and her mind has been manipulated by Am to constantly crave sex. She has sex with all of the men in the group who alternate between abusing her and protecting her. And last we have Benny, who was a brilliant and handsome scientist that Am has turned into an ape-like creature with oversized genitals. He has completely lost his sanity, and Am removed his homosexuality that he originally had and replaced it with a constant desire to abuse Ellen. The five of them travel 100 miles to reach the food in the ice caves. On the way there, they're harassed by Am, and then Benny attempts to make an escape, and his eyes are melted by Am, leaving him completely blind. The five eventually reach the ice caves and find the canned food, but realize that they don't have any tools to open it, and then in a fit of rage, Benny attacks Gorrister and begins to eat his face off. Gorrister then screams in pain, which dislodges some icicles from the ceiling. Ted then realizes that while they cannot kill themselves, they can kill each other. They just almost never have weapons. So he takes one of the icicles that fell and he stabs Benny and Gorrister to death. Ellen then kills Nimdok the same way, and Ted finishes her off again with the icicle. Am is unable to resuscitate the four, but he stops Ted from killing himself. In an act of rage, Am turns Ted into a gelatinous, amorphous blob who is unable to harm himself. Am also alters his perception of time so that every second feels like hundreds of years. Ted finds comfort in the fact that he was able to kill the others, but he still lives in constant, unending agony. The story ends with Ted's thought and the title of the story, "I have no mouth and I must scream." This story is really good and definitely disturbing. Seeing all of the characters twisted into the worst versions of themselves is really sad to me, and then Ted's fate is, of course, awful. If you like sci-fi, then I feel like reading this is a rite of passage. It's a quick read and has been incredibly influential in sci-fi horror and the body horror genre. It's an easy recommendation if you want something that's not as intense as some of the other stuff near the bottom of this iceberg. Lord of the Flies is a 1954 novel written by William Golding about a group of British boys who become stranded on an abandoned island. Ralph, a charismatic boy, and his overweight friend Piggy find a conch shell, which Ralph uses to gather the survivors. Spoilers ahead. Ralph attempts to establish order and creates a smoke signal that the group is always to maintain in order to attract any passing ships. Ralph and a red-headed boy named Jack use Piggy's glasses to create the signal fire. Quickly, things start going south and the group of kids grows more unruly. The boys grow paranoid of an imaginary creature called the Beast, and then Jack promises to hunt and kill this beast in order to gain favor of the boys. Jack takes the boys hunting and the signal fire goes out and nobody's attending to it, and that's when a passing ship fails to notice the boys and just sails right by. One night there's a dog fight happening overhead and the dead body of a fighter pilot parachutes to the island and is mistaken by two boys as the Beast. Jack then goes off to form his own tribe and more boys start to join him, becoming feral and tribal and carrying around the head of a pig on a stick that they think will ward off the Beast. One of the boys discovers the body of the dead pilot and goes to tell the tribe that the Beast isn't real, but then he is mistaken for the Beast and beaten to death by all the boys, including Ralph and Piggy. Jack steals Piggy's glasses, which are their only method of starting a fire as well. Ralph and Piggy confront Jack, and one of the members of his tribe drops a boulder on Piggy and kills him, which also shatters the conch that they use to gather everybody. Ralph flees and then is informed that Jack plans to hunt him the next day. Jack and his tribe set fire to the forest and chase after Ralph, who escapes and falls in front of an adult who has made landfall on the island. This adult is a naval officer who landed on the island to investigate the fire that Jack and his people set in the forest. Upon seeing the officer, all of the boys start crying and bemoan the death of their innocents. The officer is disappointed in the boys, saying that they've all gone feral, and the book ends with the assumption that the boys will be rescued by the officer. This book is definitely a little disturbing, and it's one of those cases where the plot seems like it's been overdone, but that's only because it essentially formed the entire trope of kids going feral and left with no authority figures. I think a big reason this book is on the list is because, at least in the US, this book is often required reading in high school and sometimes even middle school. I didn't have to read it in high school, but I think my brothers all did. It's not super intense, but it's definitely more disturbing than the average required reading novel for public schools. Although, I don't know, somebody on the last video said that they were required to read Perfume, the Story of a Murderer, which was like pretty far down on the iceberg and definitely really disturbing, so maybe I just don't know. Level 3. A Scanner Darkly is a science fiction novel written by Philip K. Dick and published in 1977. The book is semi-autographical and takes place in a dystopian Orange County, California in the then future of 1994. This book includes an extensive portrayal of drug culture and drug use, and I will be spoiling it. The book follows Bob Arctor, an undercover police agent who lives with drug users and is sent to spy on them. Bob keeps his identity hidden from the drug users in the house as well as the police in order to avoid contaminating the investigation. Bob then grows addicted to a psychoactive drug called Substance D. The book follows Bob Arctor, an undercover police agent who lives with drug users and is sent to spy on them. Bob keeps his identity hidden from the drug users in the house as well as the police in order to avoid contaminating the investigation, but then Bob grows addicted to a psychoactive drug called Substance D. Bob starts to fall in love with his drug dealer and goes by the name Fred when he is undercover. As he grows more addicted to the drug, his mind scrambles and eventually separates into the two hemispheres of his brain, causing him to essentially live two separate lives. Very severancy. Struggling with his sanity, Donna, who is his drug dealer that he's falling in love with, takes him to a rehab facility where it is revealed that she was actually an undercover agent the entire time, tasked with infiltrating this rehab facility. And inside the facility, he is forced to participate in cruel kind of group dynamic games intended to break the will of the patients. At the end of the novel, Bob is sent to work at the farming commune of the rehab facility. His mind has been completely ruined after the withdrawal from Substance D, and he's now just a shell of who he once was. He notices that there's some blue flowers hidden among the rows of corn that they are farming, and these flowers are the source of Substance D. In the end, Bob hides one of these flowers in his shoes and resolves to give it to more undercover police officers that are posing as recovering addicts at the farm as well. This book is really strange. The whole thing feels kind of like a fever dream, and it's supposedly semi-autobiographical as the authors struggle with drug addiction himself. Most of the disturbing content comes from the treatment of the addicts at the rehab facility and just the general conditions of the drug users in this book and just the way that they live. It's all kind of gross. It's also very explicit with its drug use and explores the consequences of being hooked on illicit substances. Nothing too crazy, but definitely not a walk in the park either. Blindness is a 1995 novel written by Jose Saramago. It's Portuguese, I don't speak Portuguese. It is the story of an unexplained mass epidemic of blindness that afflicts nearly everyone in an unnamed city. We follow a couple of characters who are among the first to be stricken with the blindness. One of them is an ophthalmologist who's an eye doctor. His wife is somehow immune to this disease, however. The sudden onset of blindness causes a widespread panic and just the total degradation of society. Our main group of characters spends most of the novel in an overcrowded asylum where all order has completely collapsed and they are being quarantined in an attempt to stop the spread of the illness. Spoilers ahead. The military is supposed to be distributing medicine and supplies, but as the soldiers slowly succumb to the blindness themselves, they grow tired and complacent, and then fearing that the inmates will escape, they gun down a group of them while they're waiting for a food delivery. Eventually, an armed gang takes control of the food deliveries and starts to attack their fellow inmates. They sexually abuse, assault, and starve them, and this results in all-out carnage, and the asylum is burned down with our main characters joining the crowd of newly freed blind people that survived the burning of the building. The outside world turns just as bad as society has completely collapsed at this point. People are beaten and killed on the streets, children are ripped from the hands of their parents and assaulted. The blindness seems to show no sign of slowing down either. But then at the end of the novel, the blindness just suddenly lifts from the city as suddenly as it arrived, leaving society in ruin with absolutely no hope of rebuilding. This is definitely an interesting novel, and it has some absolutely gnarly sections in the asylum. It's a terrifying concept and delivers on that without kind of resorting to pure shock value. This is another one that I would recommend to a lot of people who are watching this video, even though you know kind of the whole story of how it goes. The story is unique, and seeing the idea of a pandemic used in a unique way with everybody becoming blind was a really interesting take on that genre. Beowulf's Children is a science fiction novel written by Larry Niven, Jerry Purnell, and Stephen Barnes, and is the sequel to a book called The Legacy of Hero. I'm just going to level with you guys. I have no idea what's going on in this book, nor why it's on this iceberg. I've read a couple of different summaries and reviews of it, and it's almost unintelligible. I'm sure it's mostly because it's the second book in the series, and I haven't read the first one yet. It seems to follow a group of colonists that have migrated to a new land or planet or something. I couldn't find anything particularly disturbing about this book either. You'd think somebody would have mentioned something. There is a storm of yellow sand that shreds a couple people to death, so maybe that's the disturbing part. If you have read this and you want to explain to me why this book is so messed up, then please do. I cannot understand this book right now. So maybe check this series out if you like science fiction and want something that might be disturbing, but I'm not going to be much help on this one. Sorry about that. This was seriously like trying to read a foreign language that I don't understand. Clown in a Cornfield is a 2020 young adult horror novel written by Adam Cesari. The book is about a rural town where there's a lot of tension between the more carefree, rebellious teenagers of the town and the rigid, traditional adults. Eventually, this killer clown, who's kind of like the mascot of the town, shows up at a high school party and starts to murder the teens one by one. We also learn that it seems like the clown isn't acting alone. I've only read like the first little portion of this book and like some parts in the middle where the deaths start to happen, and it really does seem like a good read. I would recommend it probably. While it is a young adult novel, there are some really nasty kills, and it definitely fills that slasher urge that a lot of people are looking for in a horror novel. I wouldn't call this book like disturbing beyond what you typically find in a pulpy horror novel, but it seems like a good read. I know there are several sequels to this book, and it's actually supposedly getting a movie adaptation this year, so hopefully that will be good. I love horror movies. The book is definitely a little campy, and the characters are all stereotypes, but that seems like that's what the author is going for. I'm going to spoil the ending for you right now, so if this book sounds interesting, then please just skip this next part. Ready? Okay, we find out that the killer clown is murdering the teenagers because it's all part of this big ploy by the older people in the town to reclaim their culture from the progressive youth. It's definitely a fun twist on something that you would see in like Children of the Corn. It's kind of the inverse of that story, which I thought is a unique take on things. Like I said, nothing too crazy or disturbing, but sometimes these newer horror novels can be really fun. I read one last year called How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, and it was also like pretty silly and campy, but I really enjoyed it. It's not like peak fiction, but I had a really good time with it nonetheless. The Bad Seed is a 1954 horror novel written by William March. This book is about an 18-year-old girl named Rhoda Penmark, who is the only child of Christine and Kenneth Penmark. Rhoda is avoided and kind of shunned by her classmates who can sense that something isn't right with her. Those are some smart kids. Spoilers ahead for this one, but one of Rhoda's classmates, Claude, dies, and then Christine, the mom again, is shocked that Rhoda seems entirely unbothered by this. Christine learns that Claude had won an award for his good handwriting shortly before his death, and Rhoda was intentionally jealous of that award. You can kind of see where this is going. Christine gets suspicious of Rhoda and starts to look back at troubling events in her life with no explanation seemingly. She then deduces that Rhoda killed both her family dog and then also her old elderly babysitter. She then finds out that her birth mother, again Christine's birth mother, was a violent serial killer, but this had been kept from her entire life. Now convinced that she has passed on violent genetics to her daughter, Christine starts to think about what to do with Rhoda. The maintenance man at the complex that they live in as well is the only other person that seems to be aware of how evil Rhoda is. He confronts her and tells her that he knows that she killed Claude. Rhoda then waits until he is asleep and lights his mattress on fire. She keeps him locked in the shed until he burns to death and then grows like excited at his screams of agony. Christine witnesses this and confronts Rhoda about all the murders for which Rhoda shows no remorse. In an attempt to stop her daughter from turning into a serial killer, Christine secretly gives Rhoda an overdose of sleeping pills and then shoots herself in the head, killing her. A neighbor hears the gunshot and investigates and saves Rhoda before she is killed by the overdose. The book ends with the father returning home, now heartbroken over the loss of his wife. There are no witnesses or anybody who knows about Rhoda's evil nature, so she walks completely free with no consequences. So yeah, this book is definitely dark. Just reading about psychopathic children is always really freaky to me. There are a lot of horror movies and novels that follow this blueprint, but I'm pretty sure this was like one of the first novels, if not the first novel, to establish that trope. The fact that Rhoda goes free and the mother commits a violent suicide is definitely really eerie to me. No one's going to end up knowing what Rhoda did, and she'll most likely continue to kill people and get away with it. It's just unnerving stuff. Child of God is yet another Cormac McCarthy novel. This time, the story focuses on a violent serial killer and outcast in Tennessee in the 1960s named Lester Ballard. This guy is seriously like maybe the most revolting, awful protagonist I've ever experienced in a book. There is like nothing redeeming about him. He is just disgusting and evil and filthy. Spoilers ahead. At the beginning of the book, he is evicted from his home. His house is then sold to a man named John Greer. Lester ends up squatting in an abandoned cabin and spends his time watching young couples in their cars in hopes to see them get it on. He's then falsely accused of sexual assault and spends 9 days in jail. After his release, when he is out squirrel hunting, he finds a dead couple in an abandoned car. He steals their money and commits necrophilia with the dead woman, storing her corpse in the attic of his cabin. The cabin then burns down with the corpse inside, and he takes up residence in a nearby cave. He visits a friend's house and comes across their daughter and a disabled child. He attempts to sexually assault the girl, who rejects him. He then murders her and sets the house on fire, taking her body back to the cave. He also shoots a young couple in the car and takes the corpse of the woman back to the cave as well. He attempts to kill John Greer, the man that bought his house, but he is shot and wakes up handcuffed to a hospital bed. A group of men threaten to hang him if he doesn't show them where he hid the bodies of his victims, so he leads them to the cave but escapes and slips further into the cave where no one else can find him. He wanders the cave in darkness for 3 days before tunneling his way out and returns to the hospital. After that, he's sent to a mental hospital where he dies of pneumonia soon after. This book is obviously disturbing in its subject matter, but it's the way that Cormac McCarthy writes the book that makes it so gross to me. You just follow Lester's thought process as he kills and sexually abuses people. You hear his terrible thoughts about the world and the sick way that he views women and children. This is definitely an interesting novel, and I have loved all of Cormac McCarthy's books, so if you're wanting to get into the mind of a fictional serial killer, then I would have to recommend this book. Level 4. Lolita is a 1955 novel written by Vladimir Nabokov, and if you know what this book is about and the reputation that it has, then you won't be surprised to find it on this iceberg. The book centers around a man who is only known by his pseudonym Humbert. Now, before I go through this entire story and spoil the whole thing, I'll just tell you kind of the synopsis of what this book is about. It's about Humbert, who has a sexual fascination with children and grooms and assaults a particular child for an extended period of time. So if that sounds interesting to you or something you might want to read, then I'd go ahead and read it because I'm about to do a pretty detailed synopsis of this book. So buckle up. The novel starts with a fictional foreword written by an editor of psychology textbooks. He states that he is presenting the memoir of Humbert, who has recently died in jail while awaiting trial for an unspecified crime that we'll learn about in a minute. Humbert spent his child on the French Riviera and fell in love with another girl his age, Annabelle Lee. She tragically dies of typhus while still really young, which causes Humbert to become sexually attracted and obsessed with girls from the ages of 9 to 14, kind of the age that Annabelle Lee died in. He calls these girls nymphets, which is just a gross term. Humbert graduates college, gets married, but the relationship just ends quickly when his wife leaves him suddenly for another man. He moves overseas to the US and finds a house that he intends to move in, but then the house is destroyed by a fire, and in his search to find a new place to live, he finds a widow named Charlotte Hayes who is looking for someone to move in with her. She insists on showing Humbert her house, and he goes along with it out of politeness, but intends to refuse the offer. His plans change, however, when he sees Charlotte's 12-year-old daughter sunbathing in the garden. Humbert sees this girl as the perfect nymphette and moves in with Charlotte to groom her. The girl's name is Dolores, and Humbert calls her Lolita. He moves into the house and is always on the prowl for discreet methods of fulfilling his sexual urges. He savors even the smallest physical touch and is just generally a huge creep towards her. She goes away to a summer camp, and Charlotte tells Humbert that he must either marry her or move out. Humbert marries Charlotte, becoming Dolores' stepfather just because he wants to be closer to Dolores. He keeps a journal containing all of his sexual fantasies towards her and then his disgust towards his now wife, Charlotte. He starts to drug Charlotte with sleeping pills so that he can plan to one day do the same with Dolores. While Dolores is at a summer camp yet again, Charlotte discovers Humbert's journal and is both embarrassed and disgusted with it. She writes letters detailing the sick desires of Humbert and plans to send them to her friends. Humbert then tries to convince her to stay by saying that his journal is just the outline of a novel that he plans to write. Charlotte doesn't believe this obvious lie and runs out of the house to send the letters, but she is then hit and killed by a swerving car. Humbert destroys the letters and picks up Dolores from summer camp, telling her that Charlotte is ill, and then he takes her to a hotel and drugs her. While waiting for the pills to take full effect, he meets a mysterious man who seems to know what Humbert is up to. He then returns to the room to find that the drug that he gave Dolores wasn't as strong as he has hoped, and that while she is drowsy, she is far too alert for Humbert to sexually assault her. The next morning, Dolores confesses to Humbert that she engaged with sexual activity with an older boy at the summer camp. Humbert uses this opportunity to advance on her and sexually assaults her. The two then drive around the country for the next little while, and Humbert continually bribes Dolores for sexual favors. It's all very, very gross. This entire time, Dolores is clearly struggling mentally. She often cries at night and is ashamed of what she's doing with Humbert. While Humbert frames the relationship as a loving one, he has groomed and manipulated her and is nothing more than just an awful, terrible child predator. The two settle down for a while in a town before going on another road trip, but Humbert grows paranoid and feels that the two of them are being followed. Dolores then gets sick and stays in a hospital, and while checking in on her, Humbert finds that she is gone and was discharged by someone who claimed to be her uncle, even though she doesn't have any living uncles. Humbert searches for Dolores for a while, but is unable to find her. And then 2 years later, he receives a letter from the now 17-year-old Dolores, who is in desperate need of money. He tracks her down and finds that she is pregnant and married to a man named Richard. She explains that she was abducted by a playwright named Claire Quilty, who tracked her down and took her from the hospital because she was in love with him. They were together for a little while, but then he kicked her out when she refused to star in one of his pornographic films. Humbert begs Dolores to leave with him, but she refuses. Smart girl. Humbert then gives her the money from her inheritance and then goes to Claire Quilty's mansion and shoots him dead. He is arrested shortly afterwards and requests that his memoir is released after his death. So yeah, it's quite the roller coaster of a story. This book is definitely disturbing. The grooming of Dolores is incredibly unsettling, and it's made even more so because people like Humbert actually exist in our world today. This book is very upsetting, but it's also written really well. Like, it's like regarded as a very well-written novel. The problem is that a lot of people, for some reason, don't pick up on the fact that Humbert isn't supposed to be sympathetic. He's just supposed to be this terrible, awful monster. Philth is a 1998 novel written by Irvine Welsh and follows Bruce Robertson, a detective sergeant serving in Edinburgh. And he is just a real piece of work, of human garbage, you could say. This guy spends most of his time snorting cocaine, getting drunk, and then just sexually abusing those around him and plotting to hurt the people that he works with. The book is written in first person, and the actual prose and structure of the writing is actually really well done and great. And you really just feel like you're inside this guy's head. The only issue is that you probably want to be as far away as possible from this guy at all times. Some spoilers here, but Bruce commits crimes that are covered up by his workmates, and as his mental health deteriorates throughout the novel, he ends up taking his own life in front of his daughter and regrets this, but only because he intended for his suicide to be a punishment for his ex-wife instead. Anyways, if you're looking for a great book about a terrible person, then this might be for you. I'll probably not go into as much detail for all these books as I'm worried this video will end up being just way too long, but I'd give this one a read if you're interested in what I described though. Let the Right One In is a 2004 horror novel written by John Ivi Lindquist, I think is how you'd say that, and it's about a 12-year-old boy who befriends a young girl that's actually a centuries-old vampire. While that premise seems kind of tame compared to most of what we talked about here, there's some definitely nasty stuff that happens in this, so spoilers ahead. We have a character that disfigures himself with acid and throws himself out his window in an attempt to kill himself, only to be resurrected as a vampire. He is furious at this and chases the young vampire girl down and attempts to sexually assault her. We have another character who turns into a vampire and willingly ends her own life by walking out into the sun. The book is also capped off by a vampire girl saving her friend from being drowned in a pool by two guys and then beheading them. This book is actually super intriguing to me, and I swear I've watched a scene where two bullies were decapitated in a pool, so I think I might have watched the movie adaptation of this at one point. I watch a lot of horror movies though, so they just kind of tend to blend together at one point, and it's been a while since I've seen this if I have seen it. Definitely one to check out if you want a unique take on a vampire story, and I love a healthy dose of disproportionate bully justice, which has been seen in a couple novels on this iceberg. Hell House is a book that's going to have a shorter entry in this video because I'm actually very intrigued with it, and I want to read it all for myself without it being spoiled. Maybe I'll make a deep dive on this later, but it seems like it's my kind of book. The book is about a haunted house that a dying millionaire wants to use to investigate the possibility of life after death. He hires a crew of people to enter the Hell House, as it is known, and to report anything they can find. The house was supposedly the site of many blasphemous and satanic acts. The reason I'm incredibly interested in this novel, beyond my absolute love of haunted houses, is that Mike Flanagan said that he would have adapted it if he was asked to make a third installment of his Haunting series. The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor are two of my favorite shows of all time, and Flanagan is my favorite director. So I'd love to read this novel and imagine what he would have done in his loose adaptation style that he's used for his series. I've ordered a copy of it and I'll report back if it ends up being super interesting. If you have read this, then please leave your thoughts down below. Living Dead Girl by Elizabeth Scott is a 2008 novel about a 15-year-old girl named Alice that lives with a man named Ray that everyone assumes is her father, but he actually abducted her 5 years earlier and has starved her, dressed her in child's clothing, and held her captive this entire time. She is under the impression that if she tries to escape, Ray will kill her family. Ray sexually abuses her constantly, and Alice just wishes for the day when Ray will finally kill her. He had abducted a girl before that he also called Alice that he killed when she started maturing into adult, and this new Alice is now recruited into finding a replacement for herself. Spoilers for this next little bit, but she studies girls at the park and finds one that she thinks would be the perfect replacement for her. She approaches this girl named Lucy and is rejected, being told that she doesn't want to play with her. Alice then meets Lucy's older brother and has sex with him in order to learn more about Lucy. A police officer notices Alex and can sense that something is wrong. She tells Ray that Lucy will be playing at the swimming pool, which is information that she learned from her brother, and Ray is furious when he can't find her there. Alice starts to feel remorseful about trying to give Lucy to Ray and goes to the park to try to warn her about him. Ray then catches up to her at the park trying to warn Lucy, and then Ray starts to strangle Alice to death before being shot and killed by Lucy's brother. Alice is also wounded, and the book ends with her dying and being glad that she is finally free from the torment that she has been living in up to this point. Definitely a disturbing book. Anything that deals with grooming and abduction and sexual assault is really messed up because these are things that are not uncommon in the real world. I have read some horrible cases just like this novel, and this book does seem really well written though, so if you want to read something like this but don't want to engage in like real world horrors and actual true crime stuff, then this would be a good one to check out. Also, fun fact, this book was banned in a Texas school district in 2024, but not for the reasons that you might think. It wasn't banned for graphic depictions of sexual violence or pedophilia, but rather for promoting gender fluidity, which it doesn't really seem to do, at least not that I could see. It seems like some odd priorities, but that's neither here nor there. Thirst is a 1997 horror novel written by M.T. Anderson about a teenage boy who discovers that he is a vampire. This book honestly didn't seem too disturbing from what I have read. It deals with the typical things that a vampire novel has, like an uncontrollable thirst for blood and then hunting and killing pets to satiate that thirst for blood. One thing that is really interesting about the book is that the mythology of the vampires is definitely more fleshed out than you would typically see. There's a lot of lore about an ancient vampire who's locked under the town and can only be killed with a specific relic. It seems like an interesting read if you like teen novels and are interested in reading a teen vampire novel that isn't the Twilight series, but I don't know if I would call it particularly disturbing in its subject matter. There's a certain hopelessness that our main character has as he doesn't want to be a vampire, but he can't stop his transformation. Again, nothing too crazy, but it seems like a good young adult novel. Definitely not my thing. I prefer the intensely morbid, psychological kind of disturbing books that make you feel like a shell of a person after you're done with them. Level 5. The Slutz is a 2004 novel about an online community that discusses Brad, a gay sex worker. The group grows obsessed over finding out his true identity and divulges their sexual excitement regarding a whole bunch of gross acts and disgusting things. The book won the SAD Prize, or SAD Prize, which is an award given to particularly controversial and provoking books. It's named after Marquis de Sade, who wrote 120 Days of Sodom, which we covered in the last video. The book is presented as an online forum, and we learn that Brad is being pimped out by his abusive partner. The forum tries to find out anything they can about him, but his physical description seems to change, and all of his physical details seem to change and not really be entirely clear. Like I said, this book deals with a lot of sexual fantasies about gross things, including castration, necrophilia, snuff, and bug chasing. If you don't know what bug chasing is, it's the act of actively searching out and contracting sexually transmitted diseases, mostly HIV. One of the reasons that this book is so fascinating but unsettling is just getting to see the bizarre fixation that these forum members have with Brad. He is presented as somebody who is being taken advantage of and clearly needs help, but the members of the forum aren't interested in helping him at all. It mirrors some very real, very disturbing online communities that have revolting fixations and are only able to indulge on them online with other strangers. It's actually quite impressive that the book was written in 2004, because I feel like the practice of a niche, degenerate internet community wasn't nearly as common then as it is now. The Story of the Eye is a 1928 novella written by Georges Bataille. You know, I was just thinking that this video seemed like a lot less gross than the first part of the Iceberg, but that ends now because this book has some really gross stuff in it. Spoilers, but probably don't read this one. It's about an unnamed boy and his sexual relationship with his distant cousin. Our narrator is introduced to weird fetishes when he sits in a saucer of milk, and that leads him and his cousin into a weird spiral of kinks and exhibitionist behavior. The two have sex right in front of the cousin's mother. The girl, Simone, ends up with a fetish for inserting soft-boiled eggs into herself, and I don't mean by eating them. They also participate in a violent sadomasochistic orgy with other teenagers that causes their friend to have a mental breakdown and eventually kill himself. The cousins then have sex right in front of the dead body because why not? We have a bullfighter that is killed by the bull he is fighting in a particularly violent manner, having his right eye ripped out of its socket. Simone then gets excited and sticks one of the bull testicles up into herself. The group goes to a church and Simone seduces a priest during confession. They end up performing a perverted sacrament where they desecrate the bread and wine with urine and other bodily fluids. They kill the priest and remove his eye, and Simone inserts it into herself yet again. And that's pretty much where the story ends. It's definitely a gross one. It kind of reminded me of 120 Days of Sodom, which is not really a good thing. Zombie is a 1995 novel written by Joyce Carol Oates about a serial killer who seeks to create a zombie, that being a completely passive sex slave. The idea for the story came from the real-life killings of Jeffrey Dahmer, who wanted to do something similar with his own victims. Much like Dahmer, Quentin, who is the main character of this novel, tries to turn his victims into zombies by doing improvised brain surgeries. All of these end in failure, however, and Quentin grows more frustrated throughout the novel and starts to just enjoy killing for its own sake. This book is creepy. Like, anytime you have someone doing improvised surgeries, you're in for a bad time. And it's really interesting because it's mostly based on Jeffrey Dahmer, but it's also distinct in some of Quentin's methods and motivations. In that way, it's kind of a serial killer fan fiction, but it doesn't feel nearly as tasteless as something like Proxy, which is something we covered in the last video. I don't know if I've read anything quite like it though. It's another book where you kind of get into the mind of a really creepy guy. So if those are interesting to you, if you like books like that, then definitely check this out. It's a pretty quick read as well. Black Easter is a fantasy novel written by James Blish, and it's about an arms dealer that hires a satanic magician to unleash all the demons of hell on Earth for a single day. It takes place in 1960s America and includes the depiction of the assassination of the governor of California, who is closely modeled after Ronald Reagan. A lot of this book is the detailed summoning ritual of all of the demons, and it led to the book being deemed very controversial upon release. This was during the extended satanic panic of the 20th century, so that figures. The book isn't too graphic, and it's mostly creepy in that it deals with summoning demons. I imagine that can really get to people if you believe in that kind of stuff, but I don't really believe in summoning demons, so this book didn't really do much for me. It also just fails to deliver on its insane premise, in my opinion. We get a little bit of the demons causing chaos on Earth, and I think that could be a really great premise, but it isn't explored to its full potential. Again, it was mostly controversial during its time, but it would be seen as something kind of rather tame in today's society. Coin Locker Babies is a Japanese novel written by Manabu Yamanaka about two babies that are abandoned in coin lockers and grow up in the foster care system. This is another novel where it's mostly disturbing due to the surreal nature of the writing. It reads like a fever dream. There are certainly some disturbing things that happen. We have characters who shoot and kill their own mothers. There was a guy who attempts to rip a woman apart with his bare hands, starting with her mouth. We have a city that's also been turned into a toxic wasteland. But the book also has some really odd plot threads, like one of the main characters becoming a pop star and another girl who converts her condo into a swamp for her pet crocodile. There are certainly disturbing passages, but you'll most likely be too confused to be all that disturbed. Tampa is a thriller comedy novel written by Alyssa Nutting. It is about a middle school teacher who grooms and sexually assaults two of her students. The book is graphic in terms of its descriptions of sexual encounters between our main character and literal children. It was written because the author went to school with a lady who was convicted of raping one of her male students. The author says that seeing that happened with somebody that she knows changed her perspective on male rape. I'm kind of torn on this novel. On one hand, I can see how it is tasteless to explicitly describe a sexual relationship between a teacher and a young student, but I also really get the sense that the author knows that and is trying to get the reader to realize that grooming and molestation is just as bad when it's happening to a teenage boy. I went to a high school where a very similar situation to this happened, and it was actually really bizarre seeing the reaction that most students had. A lot of people saw it as like an awesome experience for the kid and couldn't see that he was the victim of being groomed and sexually assaulted. The main character of this novel is completely obsessed with the idea of having sex with teenage boys, but is somewhat unique in the sense that she has no emotional connection to the boys that she grooms. That is typically a component of female sex offenders. They form kind of an unhealthy emotional bonds with their victims, but this particular woman doesn't. Easily the most disturbing part of the novel is the teacher forcing sex on her student while they lay next to a dead body. It is presented in a comedic way, but that encounter ends up being incredibly traumatic for the boy, as you expect that it would be. So yeah, definitely an interesting novel. I don't really know what to think about it. I didn't read the whole thing. I only read certain parts of it, but if you've read that, then please let me know what you think. It also takes place in Tampa, Florida, and that was the place where the real life male sexual assault case happens. That's why it's called Tampa. Level 6. Okay, so we're entering the final layer of this iceberg, so be warned. There's going to be a lot of terrible things that happen here. So if you don't want to hear about child predators and murderers and sadists and all those terrible things, then click away and find another video. Gemma is a 2006 novel about a 12-year-old girl who is kidnapped by a child rapist and is taken across the country to be abused and pimped out to other men. I read the first chapter of this book and it was very explicit and heartbreaking. This is a novel that describes sexual violence in brutal, graphic detail and shows the absolute hopelessness of the situation that Gemma is in. She was initially molested by her mom's boyfriend and suffers that abuse for 4 years until she's pimped out to another man who ends up kidnapping her. I will say that the book is surprisingly well written. I wouldn't go so far as to call it tasteless or cruel for the sake of being cruel. There's definitely a craft to be found here. Unlike a lot of books on this tier that I covered in the last video, this book does not glorify the terrible acts that are happening. I think it also helps that the novel was written by a woman, which just makes it feel less exploitative. It's not often that I can recommend a book in this tier, but if the intense and disturbing content doesn't really get to you, then I could see you enjoying this novel because it is well written. I think I could get through this novel, but I don't know if I would enjoy it at all. The writing style is very good, and I think a big reason that I find it so captivating is that it reminds me of the way that To Kill a Mockingbird is written, and that is hands down my favorite book of all time. Piercing is a Japanese novel about a man who has the uncontrollable urge to kill a baby with an ice pick. I can't say I relate to that in any way, shape, or form, but it's certainly an interesting idea for a novel. The book has a lot of violence in it, perpetrated by both this man and also against our main character. Most of the novel is the man attempting to convince himself to go through with the act of murdering a sex worker with the ice pick. The only issue is that the sex worker seems just as depraved as he is, and the novel becomes kind of a game of cat and mouse between the two. There are a lot of thinly veiled metaphors shared between the two that could be interpreted as either pertaining to sex or murder. The novel was actually turned into a movie in 2018 that was actually pretty well received by critics. I'm actually incredibly intrigued by this novel because almost everything on this tier usually involves rampant abuse and violence towards people who can't fight back, but this novel is different because our murderous lunatic is challenged by another competent psychopath. It is definitely still disturbing and has some really gross depictions of stabbings and self-harm and mutilation, so I wouldn't recommend this to like your neighborhood book club, but as far as level 6 books go, this could be one that I could see myself recommending to people. The Resort by Bentley Little is an absolutely insane novel, but so is everything that he writes. It's about a family that takes a vacation at a 5-star resort before they start noticing strange occurrences happening around them. They see ghosts and a dead body at the bottom of the pool. It feels very similar to The Shining. The key difference being that in The Resort, the tone of the book can shift on a dime and start describing some of the most foul, disgusting, sexual, and murderous events you've ever read about, or some person being ritually sacrificed just out of nowhere. That's kind of Bentley Little's calling card. The book is grotesque in the way that it depicts violence, but it's also considered a little bit less terrible because the violence happens in equal measure towards both men and women. And I guess a common theme in these disturbing novels is that they're usually about women being victimized. So it's interesting to see a novel with like no discrimination when it comes to the violence. And I guess a lot of people are like, they think that's interesting and cool, makes it a little bit easier to handle. There is a particularly brutal scene where a woman is killed by being chopped to death with hatchets. It's very detailed and graphic and horrifying. It also kind of comes out of nowhere like most of the stuff in this book does. This is another book that is absolutely foul, but kind of a fun read. Like I said, almost everything by Bentley Little could be on this iceberg. He has a lot of devoted fans and his writing is pretty pulpy. It doesn't really go to the lengths of being gross for the sake of being gross, but definitely tests the limits of what a reader can handle. This is another book where the absurdity of the situation helps make the more disturbing stuff seem more tame. It loops back around to just being kind of funny. It's similar to something like Terrifier and those movies where the violence should be obscene and upsetting, but it ends up just kind of being schlocky and fun. Audition is a Japanese novel written by Ryo Murakami about a widower who holds a fake casting audition in hopes of finding love to replace his dead wife. This book was made into a movie that is incredibly good, and I recommend it to anybody who loves horror and disturbing media. I'm kind of going to go with a cop-out for this entry because I went into the movie not knowing anything, and I ended up really enjoying it, even though it was a really tough watch. Without me spoiling most of what happens, just know that there's some torture involving an eyeball that really got to me. I don't know what it is about eyes, but seeing eyes getting like sliced or poked or anything like that gives me the creeps. Again, both the movie and the book are very good and very interesting and go in a lot of directions that you wouldn't expect. This is another disturbing piece of media, both the book and the movie, that I could recommend to most people. The movie adaptation is brilliant and it's highly regarded among degenerates like myself Seriously, go watch it if you haven't. It's fantastic. Room is a 2010 novel written by Emma Donoghue, told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy who is being held captive in a small room with his mother. The book is based on the real-life case of Elizabeth Fritzl, who was captured by her father and forced to live in a small bunker for years. Elizabeth was molested and abused by her father and forced to raise and birth his children. This all happened on the property of the Fritzl house, and no one else in the family knew what was going on, as they all assumed that Elizabeth had just run away. This book is a fictional depiction of a similar situation. It's not like a one-to-one thing, and the book deals with the mental state of the young child, including kind of his Stockholm syndrome towards his abusive captor. This book contains sexual violence and physical assault, but is mostly disturbing because of the mental trauma that the boy and his mother suffer at the hands of their kidnapper. This is another one of those books that is just profoundly sad. There is like some hope to be found at the end of the novel, but it is a case where 2 people have been irreparably harmed for no good reason and have to deal with the weight of that for the rest of their entire lives. It was made into a movie that was pretty good as well, and what's kind of crazy is that this book isn't even as morbid as the actual story of Elizabeth Fritzl. If you're looking for one of the absolute worst true crime cases you'll ever hear about, then I suggest reading up about that or watching a video on it. It's super messed up. And for the final entry in this video, we have Come Closer, a novel written by Sarah Gran about a woman who hears a strange noise in her apartment, leading her to conversing with a demon that has taken up residence with her. This is another book that I'm definitely going to read myself and maybe do a deep dive on. From what I can tell, it doesn't seem like too intense, but I love anything about demons and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. One thing that makes this book kind of unique is that it's up to the reader to decide whether the woman is actually talking to a demon or whether she's mentally ill. It can kind of be interpreted either way. Like I said, I'm going to have to tease a future video with this one because I really want to read it, and I'm going to order it here pretty soon. If you have read it, then please let me know what you thought in the comments. No spoilers though, if you can help it. I know I spoil some stuff sometimes, so I can't really talk. And that is going to do it for part 2 of the Disturbing Books Iceberg. The support on part 1 has been absolutely insane. I'm so glad that you guys enjoy hearing me ramble on about this horrifying, disgusting stuff that I can't really talk about with my wife or most normal people. I'm going to be doing a part 3 of these videos for sure because they're just so fun to make. I love researching all these things, and writing the scripts is a ton of fun. I like recording them and editing. It's just a very fun process for me. But in the meantime, I also will release some shorter videos about non-horror related content or stuff that isn't quite as in-depth as these videos are nearly as long because these take a while to make. So if you're interested in that, then please watch those videos as well and support me there. And again, please subscribe if you haven't. I'm closing in on 2,000 subs, which is absolutely wild. Like I said, I was really just trying to hit 1,000 subs by April, and now I'm at 1,600 or something. I'm getting really close to 2,000, which is just absolutely crazy. Thank you guys so much for watching. You've been wonderful. The comments have all been great, even when you're kind of roasting me. The support really does mean the world to me, and I will catch you in the next one. See ya.